started, and you guys just feel free to continue getting your food. So we just want to make sure that our speaker has time to give his presentation today. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome on behalf of the Latin American Caribbean and Mediterranean Studies program. My name is Sarah Ritt. I'm the outreach coordinator and undergraduate advisor for the Latin American Caribbean and Mediterranean Studies program. And I'm sorry we're a little off schedule. The caterer went to the wrong building. But it's worth it, I think, because the food looks great. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements about some other events that are coming up that may interest a few of you. Tonight there is a film screening called The Harvest of Loneliness about the Precariat program, and that's happening at 6 p.m. in the Law Building. And I'll leave this in the back corner if anybody wants. This is our weekly email blast if you want more details. There's also going to be a celebration at the Cardinal Bar tonight at 6 p.m. as well on the publication of Zona de Carga, the Loading Zone of 2013. It's a literary journal. And tomorrow, another Lassie's co-sponsored event at noon in Helen C. White Hall is Citizenship and Technology in Cuba. And finally, for those of you who might be interested, there is a competition, and where did it go, for the Nabucco Award, which is a what would I call this? I guess it's for the 2 best essays on Brazil, and it's given annually. And there is a cash award of $2,000 to a grad student and one to an undergrad student. And those applications are due on May 10th, so it's a great opportunity for people to apply for. So thanks again for coming, and feel free to eat, and I'll turn it over to Alberto Vargas.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to shorten my introduction, just give you the welcome to the Mellon Foundation International Studies lecture. The Mellon Foundation is supporting UW in a process to rethink area and international studies. And one of the activities is to foster this cross-area, cross-disciplinary scholarly work and foster dialogue across our centers. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Darien Lamen. Darien is a new faculty fellow in ethnomusicology. It's a prestigious fellowship by the American Council on Learned Societies and hosted by the Institute for Research in the Humanities. Darien's primary research interests in the context of this lecture series are cosmopolitanism, mobility, media technology, and the politics of cultural labor. So join me please in welcoming Darien.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really glad to be here and to have all of you here to help me think through some things that I've been working on for quite a while, but I'm going to try to draw some connections to some things that this is a bit of a new a trial run of some ideas. So thank you in advance for helping me think through these things. Again, please feel free to get up and eat more as the mood strikes you. I won't be offended. Now, this a little explanation about this somewhat long-winded title. The Brazilian cultural economy as political economy line comes from a very seminal piece by George Udici in The Expedience of Culture from 2003, in which he argues that the cultural economy, this idea of the cultural economy, has come to has embedded within it ideas about what culture can do in terms of its socio-political utility and also its economic utility. So there are a lot of claims that begin to be made in the context of multiculturalism, specifically in Latin American democratization, a moment of Latin American democratization, about what culture can do to advance a politics of inclusion, as well as to reinvigorate national economies on the basis of immaterial labor. So in using the expression post-multiculturalist moment today, I'm not suggesting that multiculturalism no longer has any currency in Brazil as a way of agitating for resources and recognition, but I do think that there has emerged a vanguard in the last 10 years or so of thinkers and policymakers who are trying to push beyond what they see as an impasse in this kind of paradigm in which multiculturalism operates within this sort of regime of representation and performance. And they, I'm going to argue, begin to frame the locus for a new sort of cultural politics in the 21st century. They see the locus within sort of a productivist framework, that it's the actual production of culture in network that represents the greatest possibility for reinvigorating the economy and also for extending cultural citizenship to a greater portion of society. So in this emergent paradigm, this is the urban precariat and the so-called superfluous individuals of the favela will become the new subjects of cultural citizenship discourses and the key protagonists in the reinvigoration of the cultural economy. So the people whose ideas I'm going to be dealing with in most depth today, I just wanted to throw up pictures of them so that you can hopefully connect these names to some faces. The constellation of ideas being developed by individuals like lawyer Ronaldo Lemos, the celebrity anthropologist and public intellectual Hermano Viana, communications professor Ivana Benches, and the former culture minister and musical icon from the 1960s counterculture in Brazil, Gilberto Gil. These ideas have enjoyed great prominence and I would argue are having a measurable impact on cultural policy. But you know, since George Eudyce's The Expediency of Culture, since collections by Escobar and Alvarez, Ana Maria Ochoa, this work coming out of the multiculturalist moment, there hasn't been a lot of critical engagement with this kind of vanguard thinking. So what I'm going to do today is begin that process. So the talk is going to be structured in 3 main sections, followed by some closing thoughts. The first half is going to be a little theory heavy, so I apologize in advance. Hopefully it doesn't give you too much indigestion, but the second half will be much more case study based. And so for this I'm drawing on some of my ethnographic research in the city of Belém, in the Brazilian Amazon, as well as the multitudes of scholarly writing and policy writing that have come out in the last 10 years on this particular form of Amazonian electronic dance music called Tecnobrega. So that'll be the second half of the talk. So I'm going to start with superfluity and the wasted lives of the favela. Can everyone hear me okay? Today, the size of the urban population has surpassed the population of the entire planet in 1960. For the first time in the history of humanity, there are more people living in cities than in rural areas. Of particular concern is the fact that the population of large cities has continued to grow precipitously, even in spite of the formal economy's inability to incorporate them as workers. This represents a tremendous crisis for the nation state as well, since the promise of full or nearly full employment in the formal economy sounds increasingly hollow. Hermano Viana suggests the crisis is reaching a breaking point, especially in light of these demographics. Quote, "About half of the world's slum inhabitants are less than 20 years old. Nearly everyone works in the informal economy. What are they to do with all their youthful energy? Produce the foretold catastrophe? Is this all that's left for them to do? Or are they to disappear off the map so they don't cause any more problems for the rich?" End quote. While the problem of superfluity under capitalism is not new, under late capitalism, in quotation marks, it has become even more entrenched and policed along geographical and racial lines. In Louis Wacan's terms, the relative surplus population has been transformed into an absolute surplus population. The reserve army of labor transformed into a perpetual undercaste. Superfluity, as Susan Marx argues, has therefore become an ontological category. Late capitalism has produced the category of wasted human being. Structural critiques of this sort help us to train our eyes on the problem of superfluity under late capitalism, and on the fact that the contemporary forms of advanced marginality, in Kant's terms, are not transitory. Yet in the absence of the political will to address the situation from the top, these critiques offer little sense of what kind of agency, either insurrectionary or resistant, might be effectively wielded from the bottom. For many Brazilians systematically excluded from secure forms of wage labor, as well as personally fulfilling forms of professional work, the sort of critique laid out by Wakan and others has long been self-evident. They have long known or suspected that the promise of meaningful incorporation into the national political economy and into the formal economy was a false one. And in the archive of popular culture, we can find examples of this sort of critique embodied, perhaps most obviously by the turn-of-the-century figure and enduring social archetype of the malandro. The malandro is a street's wise guy who is kind of a loafer and lives in the interstices. And so Roberto da Mata is the sort of great theorist of this social archetype, sort of the perpetual underdog, and really the hero of of a lot of forms of Brazilian popular culture. In these kinds of popular culture, Hermano Viana recognizes not only the basis for trenchant critique and a repertory of resistance, but also a seed for societal transformation. He writes, quote, "Instead of disappearing, the peripheries resist and speak more loudly, much to the surprise of those who expected only more futureless misery to spring from there. The peripheries produce parallel cultural worlds where the majority of the population has come to live," end quote. The improvised solutions, temporary salves, and ingenious ways of getting by and making do are rightly privileged topics for many an ethnography conducted in this kind of celebratory mode. But my objective today is not to provide more examples of the boundless creativity that emanates from the urban periphery. It's to interrogate this impulse to celebrate boundless creativity as such. I want to interrogate the recent turn in intellectual and policy debates toward creative production as the basis for cultural citizenship, and to critically examine the tendency to declare the digital cultural production of the periphery in particular as a harbinger and a model for both a more inclusive and a more productive Brazilian nation yet to come. So to do this, I'm going to take a step back to the 1990s and set up a little bit of this idea that this productivist paradigm is really taking over where multiculturalism and this sort of performative mode of doing cultural politics has left off. At the heart of ongoing debates about culture and cultural policy in Brazil is the idea that music making is a practice constitutive of citizenship itself. In a country like Brazil, where institutional politics and popular culture have long been intertwined, this proposition enjoys a certain self-evident character. Time doesn't obviously allow for a recap of this history, so I'll merely point you to the introduction of Idelber and Chris Dunn's 2011 edited volume, Brazilian Popular Music and Citizenship, for a concise overview of the relationship between cultural economy and national political economy in Brazil. My comments here will be limited to simply tracing what I see as the transition from a multiculturalist paradigm dominant throughout the 1990s during the period of redemocratization to an emergent, productive Precariat paradigm in the 2000s. I'm going to assume some familiarity with debates around multiculturalism here, either in their relation to Latin American national contexts or in relation to the US context developed by Charles Taylor and others. As a number of Latin American nations emerged from long periods of repressive military rule, culture came to serve as the ground or warrant for making claims to rights in a newly reopened public square. Paraphrasing Renato Rosaldo, Udici wrote, quote, "Because culture is what creates space where people feel safe and at home, where they feel a sense of belonging and membership, it is a necessary condition for citizenship," end quote. Udici suggested that this paradigm demanded a performative orientation towards culture that in many senses established the limits within which it could serve as an expedient in agitating for political rights, for social inclusion, and for economic development. As has been argued by critics of multiculturalism, recognition on the basis of cultural difference not only has a tendency to reify otherness, it also reproduces institutional power, leaving unaddressed the question of who has the authority to recognize whom, and whose versions of cultural authenticity ultimately are being performed to, right? Furthermore, because of its entrapment within the logic of representation, performance, and recognition, multiculturalism often amounts to little more than a staging of diversity which attempts in vain to resolve the problem of material inequality at the symbolic level. In her seminal 2003 work, Entre los deseos y los derechos, Ana Maria Ochoa summarized the shortcomings of this paradigm in relationship to the Colombian Ministry of Culture's CREA program in the following way. Quote, diversity is a concept that attempts to respond to the crisis of the nation state, which emphasized unity and homogeneity at the expense of diversity and difference. The term's breadth is what allows it to be manipulated as a means of demanding rights. However, the terrain of the multicultural can easily end up disguising political problems and profound inequalities through the magic wand of inclusion through culture. End quote. In the face of such perceived shortcomings of the multicultural model of inclusion, one of the solutions, in quotes, that has emerged in Brazil is grounded in a productivist approach to culture. Here, the possibilities for social inclusion through culture are tied not to the legible performance of cultural essences under a logic of representation, but rather to the processes of creative cultural production already taking place that are facilitated in large part by laterally organized networks. If the paradigmatic cultural citizen under multiculturalism was the representative of a culturally bounded community, under the emergent model, it is the digitally networked entrepreneurial inhabitant of the urban periphery, the member of what Ivana Benchis calls the productive precariat. At this point, I want to read a long excerpt from an article published by Benchis in the inaugural issue of the academic journal Periferia, Periphery. Then I'll attempt to draw what I see as some of the central propositions of this kind of thinking. Benchis writes, quote, we are experiencing a singular moment of change in the axis of contemporary cultural production, with the rise in visibility of cultural production coming from the peripheries, urban outskirts, and favelas. A decentered, lateral form of cultural production that brings in embryonic form potential public policies. Policies with the possibility for redistributing wealth and power, while also constituting a site of living and not merely reproductive labor. With the primacy of immaterial labor, culture today is the site of informal, unsalaried work for those that work with information, communication, art, and knowledge, and who are not part of large corporations. It is necessary to think about new strategic agendas oriented toward this population without the presentist forces of the market or the overly centralized decisions of the state, a radicalization of democracy stimulating social productivity, end quote. So some of the things that have converged here to make digital cultural production specifically this locus for economic development and political transformation. First is this idea that I already mentioned, that culture is a practice of citizenship in Brazil. This is already a very naturalized kind of proposition. Second, this fairly in vogue theory circulating mainly in the global north that the creative economy can provide more meaningful forms of work and sort of stimulate by association the sort of post-industrial economy, right? However, what's interesting about the way Benchis sort of relates to that discourse is that the kind of cultural production that is seen as this vanguard is already taking place outside the formal economy and the traditional culture industries. So it's not a matter of incentivizing more people to become cultural producers. It's in some sense a way of a question of incorporation, right? So the fact that, moreover, that this takes place outside the formal economy and traditional culture industries means that it is imminently political from her point of view, since it makes audible marginalized voices who, as superfluous humans, had no warrant to speak in the public sphere. In effect, an alternative public sphere has been created with a transition from a lettered culture to an audiovisual public culture. And so people from the favela who wouldn't have necessarily the cultural capital of these inherited Afro-Brazilian traditions have a new warrant to speak in the public sphere. And in fact, not to speak in the public sphere of the center, but rather to create an alternative public sphere. And so this is where Hermano Viana's thinking comes into play. Because these informal cultural economies emerged in the absence of recourse to formal institutions, and because they increasingly make use of digital technologies organized along a peer-to-peer network model, they are necessarily lateral and decentralized. So the wager of Benches and Viana, taking a page directly from the playbook of Hart and Negri, Lazzarato, and the immaterial labor theorists, is that networked cultural production that brings peripheries into direct and productive relation with other peripheries creates the possibility for displacing the center and rendering it superfluous. In his manifesto for the television series Central da Periferia, ironically produced by the Global Corporation, which we'll come back to in a second, Viana goes so far as to declare this a fait accompli, claiming that the periphery, in outpacing the center in terms of cultural innovation and in displacing it in terms of mass participation, has already effectively included itself. Quote, "This informal artistic economy is the result of social inclusion achieved by force." The expression is na marra. Right? When the periphery ceases to behave like a periphery, or when it ceases to recognize its place, the place the center wished it would forever occupy, the place of one who always waits to be included, who always thinks that its liberation will come from the center. Brazil is going to have to get used to this forcible inclusion from the bottom up by leaps and bounds, end quote. The question for these intellectuals then, who have a hand on the lever of research institutions like the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, which has been sort of a major force in economy and business administration in Brazil, and also on the levers of the Ministry of Culture. The question for them becomes how to amplify these expressions, to articulate them with demands for rights in an expanded public sphere, and to guard against the enclosure of this emergent digital and social commons by corporations. So, among the varied forms of digital cultural production that have been touted as evidence of this social inclusion by force, Amazonian Tecnobrega is often celebrated as chief among them. Ivana Benches, Hermano Viana, and Ronaldo Lemos have all written about Tecnobrega, so I want to take a closer look. And I do this not to offer some kind of definitive evidence in support or in rejection of their claims, but rather as an example of just how complex and contradictory this terrain of the creative cultural industries, of the peripheries are. So transitioning now to the second half of the talk, and I'll play a video example so that hopefully we can let our brains breathe a little bit while we do that. So, a little bit about Tecnobrega first. In the city of Belém do Pará, with 1.5 million inhabitants, a city located at the mouth of the Amazonian River Basin, sound systems, like this one, have long been the cornerstone of a popular informal cultural economy, really for more than 60 years. This is a particularly state-of-the-art sound system. Sound systems are, for those of you who don't know, mobile entertainment collectives that employ DJs, producers, equipment owners, and technicians, as well as people who carry the equipment, people who sell chiclete and beers and things like this informally at these parties. It is in itself a sort of engine of economic development in the minds of these folks I've been talking about. Since 2001, an especially profitable synergy between local musicians, sound system teams, and street vendors was consolidated around a form of electronic dance music known as Tecnobrega. So this is an image from Ronaldo Lemos's book, Tecnobrega para Reinventing the Business of Music in 2008. And just to kind of explain what's going on here, rather than artists contracting their labor to record labels, and then getting money from royalties from album sales, artists are invited often, or sometimes give their labor freely to record in studios, which are often owned by the same people who run the sound systems, the aparelhagens. And so they'll record a single. The studios will then pipe it to the sound systems, who play it live for the public. They may also, these studios, give these recordings to non-authorized reproducers, so pirate vendors under a different system. They're not pirating this music because there's no official version of it. So they throw it directly to these guys. They throw it out to the ambulantes, the street vendors, and the public buys from the ambulantes, and they pay usually 10 to 15 reais, which for the periphery of Belém, 7 to 10 bucks roughly. That's a decent chunk of change. And artists then, the only thing they get out of that is publicity essentially, so that they can do their own live performances, which, by the way, have become less and less frequent with the rise of these enormous sound system enterprises. So that's the model that is so interesting to someone like Ronaldo Lemos. Because most of the money in this economy is generated not through album sales or royalties from play, but rather from live performances, the Tecnobrega economy has drawn significant attentions from advocates of open business and Creative Commons licensing.
Essays on Brazil, and it's given annually, and there is a cash award of $2,000 to a grad student and one to an undergrad student. Those applications are due on May 10th, so it's a great opportunity for people to apply for. So thanks again for coming, and feel free to eat, and I'll turn it over to Alberto Vargas.
Thank you, Sarah, and for coming. I'm going to shorten my introduction, just give you the welcome to the Mellon Foundation International Studies lecture. The Mellon Foundation is supporting UW in a process to rethink area and international studies, and one of the activities is to foster this cross-area, cross-disciplinary scholarly work and foster dialogue across our centers. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker.
To help me think through some things that I've been working on for quite a while, but I'm going to try to draw some connections to some things that this is a bit of a new a trial run of some ideas. So thank you in advance for helping me think through these things. Again, please feel free to get up and eat more as the mood strikes you. I won't be offended. Now, this a little explanation about this somewhat long-winded title. The Brazilian cultural economy as political economy line comes from a very seminal piece by George Udisi in The Expedience of Culture from 2003.
Started, and you guys just feel free to continue getting your food. So we just want to make sure that our speaker has time to give his presentation today. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome on behalf of the Latin American Caribbean and Darien Studies program. My name is Sarah Ritt. I'm the outreach coordinator and undergraduate advisor for the Latin American Caribbean and Darien Studies program. And I'm sorry we're a little off schedule. The caterer went to the wrong building. But it's worth it, I think, because the food looks great. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements about some other events that are coming up that may interest a few of you. Tonight there is a film screening called The Harvest of Loneliness about the Precariat program, and that's happening at 6 p.m. in the Law Building. And I'll leave this in the back corner if anybody wants. This is our weekly email blast if you want more details. There's also going to be a celebration at the Cardinal Bar tonight at 6 p.m. as well on the publication of Zona de Carga, the Loading Zone 2013. It's a literary journal. And tomorrow, another Lassie's co-sponsored event at noon in Helen C. White Hall is Citizenship and Technology in Cuba. And finally, for those of you who might be interested, there is a competition, where did it go, for the Nabucco Award, which is a, what would I call this? I guess it's for the two.
Today, Darien Lamen. Darien is a new faculty fellow in ethnomusicology. It's a prestigious fellowship by the American Council on Learned Societies and hosted by the Institute for Research in the Humanities. Darien's primary research interests in the context of this lecture series are cosmopolitanism, mobility, media technology, and the politics of cultural labor. So join me please in welcoming Darien.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really glad to be here and to have all of you here